Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon, and welcome to this special edition as we mark 2 years since the start of the genocide in Gaza. This is a genocide that never stopped, and the reason why we've chosen the name to mark 2 years of the Gaza genocide is that, quite frankly, since 1948, since the Nakba, the people of Palestine have been occupied, whether it's in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. The occupation by the Israelis has always been there. And it's fitting that we have this discussion. Close to 70,000 people have died, and there still seems to be the big question with regards to the future of Palestine, even though there has been a recognition from major Western countries for there to be a state of Palestine. Let me welcome my guest to discuss this, and we're going to be having this discussion for the next 45 to 50 minutes. I'd like to welcome Zeenat Adam, and of course, as you see, the setting today we have is much more of a podcast setting, so we wanted to do things a little bit different. Of course, Zeenat served at the Afro Middle East Center. Of course, she was its deputy executive director. She's also a analyst, a well-versed individual when it comes to the Middle East. Zeenat, I know we've had you on Zoom, so it's good to have you at our studio. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you so much for inviting me to your
No,
studios.
it's an absolute pleasure. Zeenat, we are 2 years on, over 730 days. Um, I guess where are we in terms of this genocide in Gaza? So much has happened that has changed the world's perception, but also has, I think, educated many individuals with regards to what we have seen since October the 7th, 2023.
I think the way that you introduced our program
Mm,
today for us is really apt
mm,
in bringing us back to 1948 and the very beginning of the Nakba.
mm,
But we can even rewind further than that to 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was enforced by the British to get between Balfour and the Rothschilds.
mm,
And that gives us an indication of where the thinking by the colonialists was for Palestine. By 1948, they had already begun
mm,
introducing people foreign to this land coming from Europe, which the Palestinians welcomed after their persecution in Europe,
mm,
wanting to offer the hand of assistance and help to these refugees. What turned around was that many of these Zionist organizations developed and began to attack and raze villages. We recognized that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were removed from their homes and forced displacement took place. A lot of the people that we see in Gaza today were originally displaced from their original villages
mm,
that were then taken over during 1948. We've seen a history that has continued from then. So when we look at the events of the 7th of October, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it certainly doesn't happen overnight. We've had Gaza under siege for a number of years, where there has been an entire air blockade, sea blockade, land blockade, complete
mm,
closure. And people spoke about this long before October 7th, that this was an open air prison for 2 million people. What took place on October 7th was a resistance response to that unbearable condition of being held within this prison. And I think we need to acknowledge and recognize the context within which October 7th happened. Beyond October 7th, what we've seen for the last 2 years is absolute brutality against an entire nation with impunity by the occupying state.
mm.
And they have been allowed to do this. So when we say that 70,000 people have been killed, this is just the numbers whereby the Gaza Health
Yes.
Ministry has been able to identify this body matching with this person's name. And when we look at the Lancet report that came out, that put the numbers closer at 125,000. But just about a month ago, another report emerged indicating that the numbers could be as high as 680,000 people. that are still under the rubble.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at the disproportionate response from Israel, and if we consider what constitutes a genocide, how many more deaths are we supposed to continue counting? I remember in the early days for us, we started from October 8th, counting the dead, counting the number of people who were injured, counting the attacks on schools and on the hospitals and on the resources. We counted the number of journalists who had been killed. And at one stage, I remember standing in Lens. It was very early on, it might have been a month into the genocide. And we got the first list of the casualties. And I began reading out the names. And as I did that, I looked at the spreadsheet that was in front of me. And I stopped in my tracks because it wasn't just names for us. We were looking at the deaths of human beings before they were born. And I couldn't allow myself to complete. I choked on those words, because how do you continue naming a person that died as a fetus? And this is happening again and again. Last week we saw that with the Australian doctor who says that she had to operate on a woman's belly to try and save the child.
And the woman who was beheaded by the Israeli occupation forces.
We've never seen something that brutal in any war, and we're watching this on our screens on a daily basis. And I think to a certain degree we sit with so much of this information, and we analyze, and people like me who've been political analysts and international relations strategists, we look at it from a very cold and political perspective. But these are human beings.
And you know, Zeenat, that's where I want to come, because obviously in the industry that I'm in, it's a numbers, 68 people died. And I'm just giving an example at the Al Bureij camp or in Deir al-Bala. But when you really look closely, these are husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, sisters, brothers, nieces, nephews. Like how we are in South Africa, all they want is to enjoy the freedoms that are given. And Israel has taken that not just for the last 2 years, but they've done so since 1948.
They've completely dehumanized all Palestinians, but more specifically those in Gaza. And when we listen to some of the rhetoric that emerges out of the Knesset members, especially those who are far right-wing, what we continue to hear is that even the babies are considered members of Hamas and need to be eliminated before they grow up to be resistance fighters. Now you tell me, Fahraaz, if you had your entire family eliminated in front of your eyes and you're a 5-year-old child, you would want to hold those people accountable and you would want justice.
Sure.
So you grow up in an environment where you are seeking that justice, and that justice is denied and not delivered to you. And this occupation and the occupier continues their brutality against you and against your family over and over again, over years and years, and it gets worse and worse. So when we hear about the idea of disarmament and we hear about the idea of eliminating a resistance, I think that what happens is that out of a situation of 2 years of genocide, you would only grow a resistance in different names. It may not be Hamas or Islamic Jihad in the future, but it would certainly still have elements of wanting to resist an occupation in every element of it.
Zeenat, prior to October the 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu has the spending, fraud and corruption case. And this is what's happening. He wants to reform the judiciary system within Israel. He wants to change certain things that Israel, in its way of saying, well, we are a democracy, do it in a way which spells authoritarian leadership. I'm sure you are following it also, and it's conversations we've had also with regards to this. So the writing was on the wall for Benjamin Netanyahu, and one can't but help that what happened on October the 7th, when that military operation occurred in southern Israel, played into the hands of Benjamin Netanyahu And as we speak right now, on October the 7th, 2025, he remains the Prime Minister of Israel, and he could win another election because the way he has handled the domestic affairs has really showed signs of elements of dictatorship. And if we are to take the highest number of Palestinians that have been killed, that's over 600,000. And to him, it's quite clearly a number, but a number that suits his convenience for him to stay in power.
Well, certainly. I mean, if we look at the history of Netanyahu in all of his political terms, war has been a means of his longevity in his political life. And he decided to get into bed with people like Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, and others in order to win the last election. Exactly. In order to secure his position as prime minister, and he needed their vote and their support, but it came at a price, and the price was, we want to see the expansion of a greater Israel, and we want to have the annexation of most of this territory. We want the expansion of the settlements, and he has played into their hands because it certainly means it keeps him out of the courts, it keeps him out of jail. But beyond that, what it is the implementation of an ideology that began at the very essence of Zionism. Ben-Gurion was one of the first to talk about this. So the establishment of an Israeli state was not simply within those 1948 borders. The idea behind it was always for a greater Israel and that expansionism, and this gave them the opportunity to begin to implement that with impunity, without having any regard for international law. And in fact, what it did was it exposed to us that we have all of these elements within the United Nations. You've got the ICC, you've got the ICJ, you have beautiful international relations infrastructure that has been built over decades, that's supposed to prevent a war like this, supposed to prevent a genocide, and supposed to deliver on justice. And when it comes to Israel, that completely falls away. At the United Nations Security Council, we've seen the veto power used over and over again to prevent any resolution from going forward that would hold Israel to account. And when South Africa took the case to the ICJ, immediately there were punitive repercussions for South Africa. There have been threats against South Africa and any other country that has pledged support for the ICJ case. And of course, the prosecutor at the ICC has been threatened with his own life for actually trying to...
Judge Karim Khan,
trying to take the case forward. So we really wonder that when we have all of that international architecture, how does it actually work? If we are unable to stop a genocide like this, if we're unable to have any justice for the Palestinian people, and if people like Benjamin Netanyahu are able to just continue with this onslaught on Palestinians, and not just on them, to be embarking on a war with 7 other countries, bombing Syria, bombing Yemen, Iran, more recently Tunisia because of the flotilla,
and also Qatar,
with
the
the
Hamas,
mediation table, and all you got was a sorry.
Zeenat, I have to stop you there. We have to go for a break. After the break, we're going to be discussing international law, and does international law still exist in times of impunity? This is a genocide that never stopped. Do stay tuned. This is a genocide that never stopped. It's our special show here on October the 7th on Hilaal TV. And of course, for this edition, we are doing something different through a podcast method. And my guest today is Middle Eastern political analyst Zeenat Adam. Zeenat, let's talk international law, because obviously the ICJ had delivered its recommendations, its advisory on January 2024. Further advisories came out in May 2024, then the ICJ had delivered that Israel is committing apartheid not just in Gaza but the occupied West Bank territories of July 2024. Israel has looked at these international law books, burnt it, said we don't really care much about it. One of its ministers, if I stand to be corrected, said that international law does not apply to quote unquote Jewish people. If that's not impunity at the highest level, I really don't know what is.
It's shocking what we've been able to witness in the last 2 years, but I think it's an exposure of a broken international system. And as much as, I mean, we had UNGA just a few days ago, as much as we want to believe that the system is still working, it's completely fallen apart. And it's being held together not even by string right now. When we look at the cases at the ICJ, this one that South Africa has brought, the case for genocide, we've had the provisional measures put forward, and Israel has completely discarded that. They have no interest in meeting up to those decisions. But the court takes a very long time to reach a final decision on whether or not genocide is being perpetrated by Israel. In the interim, you've had numerous other organizations and bodies. You've had the UN Commission led by Navi Pillay,
Yes.
coming out very recently.
You had two Israeli, you had B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights, which, I mean, it's quite unprecedented that you have two Israeli human rights organizations coming out, which just shows within their own society, the very little that's there, are calling out the government for what they're doing.
And recognizing what this is. B'Tselem is one of the organizations that a long time ago had even come out and said what we see happening in Palestine, and this was before the genocide, is apartheid. So you do have those Israeli organizations, you have conversations like that happening, but they are being thwarted. And the vast majority in Israel seem to be moving towards the right. What I also found very interesting is that at the outset of the hostage negotiations and the release of some of those hostages, you found Israel trying to manage the narrative around that. And if you remember, the very first group that were released with these smiles and greeting of their captors.
You remember Eden Alexander, who was released because there was direct negotiations between Trump and Hamas also.
Yes. And I mean, even now, when or just before Israel attacked Qatar at those negotiations, one of the terms that they had put on the table was, we do not want a public display of the hostages being handed over because it's damaging to their public relations, and they're trying to control that narrative. Interestingly, and I think we need to be aware of this, Fahraaz, is that from the very beginning, Israel also found fault with the idea that all of this was broadcast on TikTok. People were beginning to understand what was happening in Palestine and how the occupation managed issues related to the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. And considering how the settler colonialism is expanding. So conversations began to take place, and that's across the world, but especially in the minds of those in the West. And immediately Israel called on the United States to try and curb that. And so you had the congressional hearings around TikTok, and more recently you have an oligarch who is very closely aligned to the Zionists now taking over a majority shareholding of TikTok, with an indication that in addition to social media like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Meta, all of these, there seems to be a bid to try and control what goes out there. I know that from some of my posts, and a lot of other journalists have reported that their posts are shadow banned. We're not able to see what people are putting up because there are control measures that are being put in place in order to manage those public relations and to try and cast Israel in a better light. This genocide has completely laid bare what their agendas have been, and people are starting to question that. So we're seeing the change, and sorry for us, but we're seeing that momentum actually change the mindsets, particularly in Europe.
And that's what I want to come to, because I want to spend this time to talk about the narrative of obviously the perception change in favor of Palestine. So uh, you see a lot of the influencers, especially in the United States, who have been, quite frankly, pro-Israel. Uh, and then they've used elements like TikTok. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu once came out and said, well, if I could buy TikTok, I would do that just to have control of it. And you see, obviously, mass media, whether it's Hollywood actors, even though there's few of them who are still sort of pro-Palestinian. I know one of them currently, Michael Rappaport, he's still going on about there's no apartheid in Israel. And then you get a lot of those who are still in the pockets of AIPAC, the highly influential Zionist lobby group, but then compare that to what we're seeing on the streets, even within Hollywood, even within the entertainment industry. A few weeks ago, there was this big event that happened at Wembley Stadium, England's most prestigious stadium. And you have to think and you have to understand that perception and the understanding of what Palestinians have gone through over 70 years, the world's starting to understand that, isn't it, Zeenat?
People are starting to understand that. Governments are still trying to be very authoritarian about what happens. And about a week before the event at Wembley Stadium, I was in London and there was a protest in Parliament Square. And I stood watching this where more than 800 people, most of them over the age of 65, were arrested and dragged off under the Terrorism Act because they held banners that said, "Stop genocide, we support PAL Action." PAL Action is an organization that came up in the UK trying to curb the UK's sale of arms to Israel and the manufacture of arms at Elbit Systems that was directly fueling the genocide. And so they were proscribed by the UK government and now considered a terrorist organization. And here there were retired doctors, nurses, people in their 80s. It was really very difficult for me to sit there, and I was sitting beneath Nelson Mandela's statue. Ironically, this is happening, and you've heroized Nelson Mandela, who would have stood with the Palestinian people, who would have stood with the resistance, who had never failed in his support for armed resistance, whether that was in South Africa or in Palestine. And yet, this was happening right before my eyes, this kind of apartheid level brutality. So there is a bid to quell the voices of people who are trying to tell the truth about what's happening in Palestine, and recognizing that this is something that is spread across the world. You mentioned AIPAC, and to me, what I've seen, a lot of people think that the major decisions are taken in Washington, but what I've recognized is that AIPAC controls every senator and congressman, and I've said this on numerous occasions. That is a form of state capture. That decisions have to be made that are favorable towards the Israeli settler colonial state.
And we've seen that because even though US President Donald Trump, the perception was that many of the Democratic senators or representatives had been captured by AIPAC. But you can see it's quite buoyant with the Republican. And I want to touch on the United States because even within the US, perception is changing. There was a poll that was taken amongst the youth, and I think there was an overwhelming majority that said they actually understand what Hamas is doing as a resistance group as per the United Nations Declaration, which says you can fight an occupying power. And that was quite interesting, given that this is coming from the United States of America, where we see that everything that is associated with Islam would be frowned upon, given what we've seen in 9/11. But it's quite different when you just look at that poll, and polls don't lie in it.
It's become increasingly difficult for them to control the narrative and to control the mindsets of how people access information and understand what the laws and regulations, international law has been written. So when we talk about Hamas being a resistance movement, people are starting to identify with that. And whilst many believe that what happened on October 7th was uncalled for, from a strategy and military perspective, it was a phenomenal military exercise carried out by Hamas. Even Israelis have recognized that the planning behind that, the way in which it was conducted, was very sophisticated. But I think that Hamas did not anticipate that the response would be to the level that it has been, would be with such longevity, and would be so blatantly against international law. And we began to see that when there was scholasticide taking place, when the hospitals were attacked. And remember, the first hospital attacked, and Israel completely denied it.
Yes.
And yet it has gone on and on to target the hospitals,
It was the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, yes, yeah, I
target the
remember.
doctors, arrest some of the doctors. Again, we talk about the hostages that have been taken by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and everyone calls for the release of these hostages being a precondition towards peace. But very few people talk about the hostages that have been taken out of Gaza into Israeli detention facilities. And just a few days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet have looked at the possibility of now having death sentences. And these are people who are held in administrative detention. They are not given an opportunity to stand in a court of law. So when we talk about, or when Israel claims to be the only democracy in this region, it really fails at showing any measures of democratic principles when it comes to the people that they occupy and that they disenfranchise.
Zeenat, before we go to the break, I want to touch on the United Nations. We speak of international law. 6 times the United States had vetoed through the Security Council and the powers it's given to them for a Gaza ceasefire. Many lives would have been saved. I think of the journalist whose lives would have been saved. I think of Rajab, whose life could have been saved. And it's quite clear that when President Cyril Ramaphosa and many leaders within the global south call for reforms of the United Nations, this is the reason why. 2 minutes in it I have for you just to answer this question.
As I said earlier, Fahraaz, the system is completely broken. Reform is one of the more diplomatic ways of saying it. But if the system is broken, can we just dismantle it completely and rebuild? What other options do we have? They stood at UNGA last week making illustrious speeches, but what difference does it make for the people on the ground? Absolutely nothing. Because there's no punitive measures against Israel. Even if decisions are made at the ICJ, it gets referred back to the Security Council for implementation on the genocide. And the Security Council is going to be vetoed because you have the veto power in the hands of United States that is an absolute undying ally of Israel.
Yeah, well, obviously the speeches were happening, more and more people were being killed in Gaza. After the break, we wrap up the conversation. We're going to be going slightly a bit more. What is the future of Gaza post-genocide? Do stay tuned. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. At the United Nations General Assembly, many Western nations, including those who sit on the Security Council in terms of veto powers, France and the United Kingdom, had recognized a Palestinian state. But does that mean anything if Israel says we will not recognize a Palestine, I beg your pardon, as a state? And that comes to the question of the Zeenat, because it's quite clearly many have seen, I've spoken to many Palestinian journalists, and they've said this is a pure PR exercise from Western nations because they still fund Israel's war machine. Does a two-state discussion even matter when one nation, Israel particularly, is saying we will not recognize a Palestinian state under no circumstances?
It came as too little too late, and I think it's mainly because of the guilty consciences of these Western powers particularly the United Kingdom, 108 years after the Balfour Declaration, they are most complicit in what has taken place in Palestine, in the eradication of a Palestinian people, and not just over the last 2 years of the genocide. Certainly, they have profiteered from this, with the war profiteering, the fueling of the genocide through supply of military hardware to Israel. And let's not also whitewash this, but South Africa has also been complicit. On the one hand, we go to the ICJ and we stand before them and talk about how we want to support the Palestinians. On the other hand, we're supplying coal to the Israelis that literally fuels a genocide. So at what stage do we stand up as a people and say this is enough and this is where we draw the line? When we talk about a two-state solution, most of these countries, and including South Africa, you'll find that the statements are very cliched. I remember 20 years ago when I was still at DIRCO, I used to write some of those, and it would always be, we would recognize a two-state solution with Palestine side by side next to Israel. It doesn't make any sense to the Palestinians because on the ground that doesn't exist. On the ground you have, including in the West Bank, the complete annexation of areas and territory. You have there's no contiguous Palestinian state. So how do you even reach each other? A person from Jerusalem cannot go to Ramallah without permission. A person from Gaza has never been able to leave Gaza to go to Bethlehem. How do you manage a state in practical terms? And then you come to the idea of state apparatus, that you have completely annihilated the possibility of that. And you've got the Palestinian Authority that has gladly accepted the status quo, not standing up to say that we need to have state apparatus in order for there to be a Palestinian state. We need to be able to have territorial integrity. We need to be able to have state ministries. We need to have our own military. What kind of a state doesn't have that? What kind of a state doesn't have the capacity to allow its people to have passports that allow them to move freely? So we talk about this ideal of a Palestinian state that will never exist. And in the meanwhile, you have an occupation that says we will never recognize a Palestinian state. And we will not only try and expand our settlements, but we will now rebrand it to Judea and Samaria so that we have biblical connotations to our claim to this land. And that the day on which these states at the United Nations made that proclamation, Benjamin Netanyahu made a statement to say that he will never allow a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. How do you even engage in a conversation about that? It makes absolutely zero sense, and the Palestinian people would want to have a one-state solution that gives them equality before the law. Israel will never allow that either.
And that's the thing, Zeenat, because when you listen to the rhetoric of the Israeli government, why is it so difficult for the Western nations to understand this? And I'm trying to put myself in the more neutral perspective on this. But when you really understand the deeper malaise that is within the occupying power of Israel, it's quite clear they never had an intention to look at Palestine not just as a state, but its people as equal human beings. They've said it when they use the words Amalekite. When you hear Ben Gvir and Smotrich saying, we will annihilate them through the ethnic cleansing, the words are there. And yet the Western nations sit back and say, well, I do think Israel would allow for a Palestinian state to happen. I mean, I don't know how ignorant you could have those statements.
It's genocidal language that is used with impunity. But for a long time, and you can see that coming from the German foreign policy in particular, is this age-old guilt of what had happened during the Holocaust. But you're holding the Palestinians responsible for something you perpetrated.
Exactly.
And at what stage do we acknowledge that this is another Holocaust that is taking place? It has to be said and it has to be spoken about very clearly and openly. And we spoke about how they're trying to control the narrative. For me, one of the greatest things that stands out is the assassination and annihilation of the journalists.
Yes.
More than 270 journalists have been killed, targeted. It's to kill the story. It's to ensure that the truth is not let out, because once that truth emerges, it can be used in the ICJ, and it does expose Israel for being the monster that it is. But the Western nations don't want to acknowledge this. And greater than that is the treachery that we find from the Arab and Muslim neighbors to the Palestinians, who are selling them wholesale, undeniably. I mean, how do you continue to respect and recognize agreements that you entered into with Israel? And in this case, I'm talking about Egypt and Jordan in particular, as neighbors to the Israelis. How do you continue to say we are bound by that agreement that
The Abrahamic Accords, yeah.
Even before that,
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
we're looking at these
The
are
Sadat agreements with them, yeah.
How do you still hold on to those? And how do you, as Sisi, stand before your people and say, I'm protecting my Egyptian nation, because otherwise, if you tell me we need to go with force, it's going to mean that we enter a war and my Egyptian people will be killed. Your Egyptian people are closer to the Palestinians than you are. How are you, as the Arab nations, intercepting missiles that are headed towards Israel? How are you protecting Israel? You are more Zionist than the Israelis themselves in doing so. Your countries are attacked. Qatar, for example, and a simple sorry is enough. Where is
I
the
found that laughable.
honor? I mean,
I found that very laughable, yeah.
where's the honor? Where's the nobility of what the Arab pride used to be? How do we capitulate and subjugate ourselves as Arabs and Muslim nations? There was immediately after the attack on Qatar, they held a conference of the OIC, and the statement was so watered down. There's absolutely no integrity left. And without that, the Palestinians have no clear allies. So when we see that the streets in the United Kingdom, in Cape Town, in Washington, in New York are filled with more people than you see standing up and rising up in the Arab and Muslim world, it's really telling as to where the complicity lies.
Zeenat, when you look at the 20-point plan, post-genocide Gaza, and again, most of the Arab nations, their reaction to it, when you see what is being presented, they gave the thumbs up to US President Donald Trump, sort of like showering him with blessings. I found that very disturbing, because I would have expected there to be more attention to addressing the plight of people, the Palestinian people who have endured over 730 days of genocide. I mean, it is quite disturbing.
Let's rewind a little bit and think of the very early meeting of the Jordanian king entering into the White House, sitting next to Donald Trump and being completely humiliated on camera.
Just between him and Zelensky, who was going to be the most humiliated, yeah?
And then, of course, our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, a few weeks after that.
He held his ground there, yeah, definitely.
So that already tells you how off guard they have been and how willing they've been to subjugate themselves to Washington. The second telling is how lavishly Trump was welcomed in the Gulf states. A lavender carpet for him in Saudi Arabia.
747
jet. A 747 jet from Qatar. Trillions in aid and in investments. And what did those trillions buy? Not even your dignity. You know, it's really, really shocking that they could emerge out of the meeting on the sidelines of UNGA, where Erdogan sat next to Trump, Tamim bin Hamad al Thani to Erdogan's side and all the other leaders sitting around that table coming out and saying we are very satisfied with the decisions that have been taken, and that President Trump and Tamim bin Hamad will now make a statement in relation to that. And this is what they come up with, is this 20-point plan, and saying that basically what it does is it mirrors what we saw a couple of months ago, published in the Financial Times, which is economic colonialism of the Gaza Strip. And
Zeenat, you know what I found disturbing? Pakistan, Shahbaz Sharif, very strong. We saw what he did in quelling Operation Sindhu against India, Indonesia, Turkey. I'm thinking out of all the Muslim and Arab world, say Muslim world, those three would have been the ones that would be harder on the rights of Palestinian people.
We would have hoped so. So our question then comes, Turkey decided to continue with their support for NATO, being one of the greatest armies supporting the NATO activities. And so that is given precedence over the lives of Palestinians. Pakistan wanted to nominate Trump for a Nobel Prize.
Absolute laughable. Yeah.
And on the day that they signed an agreement, a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, one of their freight's was attacked by Israel. This doesn't come out in the news, and they kind of hide behind all of that. It's laughable. So when we look at that plan that was published by the Financial Times, and you see economic zones, you see a Riviera being created in the name of Trump, you see a lot of names put into that map, the MBZ zone and the MBS highway. It's playing to the egos of these leaders and saying, you know, we're going to name these areas after you, and we're going to rebuild Gaza in your image, and we're going to be able to have such lucrative deals out of this. Everyone will be satisfied, including the Palestinians. So we're going to pacify everyone, and this is the new Gaza we're going to create. In the same breath, you have Netanyahu saying, yeah, we'll wait until the hostages come. On the same day that he acknowledges that this 20-point plan is put before him, leaflets are still falling from the sky, telling Palestinians to leave the area. So if he is so serious about withdrawing from Gaza in terms of this 20-point plan, why are you still asking Palestinians to relocate out of these areas? Because you are going to raise this to the ground, and on the graveyard of these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, build these Rivieras, steal the gas off the coast, and turn around and say, well, Palestinians should move to the Jordan, to Egypt, or anywhere else in the world, and they have that opportunity to do so.
And who wants to head up Gaza? Tony Blair. Have people not forgotten? This is the same guy that said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Until today, they found nothing. Scott Ritter, who is probably one of the most influential UN nuclear experts, said we found nothing. Him and George Bush. Let's not forget George Bush also. This is the same person who went into or sent United Kingdom troops to Afghanistan with the aim of finishing off the Taliban. Who's still in charge of Afghanistan? Now, as we speak, the Taliban. And they want to make him some sort of, they're giving this lavish title, Viceroy. Cecil John Rhodes was the Viceroy of Rhodesia. What was obviously now, it's now called Zimbabwe. Have people not forgotten who Tony Blair is? I just find this disturbing also.
Not just that Tony Blair is a war criminal responsible for the deaths of over 1 million Iraqis, but he did so in cahoots with Netanyahu, who at the time presented before the United Nations a big plan, as he does whenever he stands before the UN with his placards indicating that this is where the weapons of mass destruction are. Saddam Hussein is planning on building a nuclear weapon, and we need to deal with him immediately. And the rhetoric hasn't changed, despite the fact that everyone knows that was a lie. But now let's reward Tony Blair. Instead of taking him to the ICC, instead of holding him account for the war crimes that he perpetrated. Admittedly, I mean, not very long ago, he stood before a room of journalists saying, yes, we made a mistake in Iraq. Too little, too late. 20 years later,
a million people through your mistake.
A million people.
Exactly.
And now you have how many people that you are going to be building a colonial project on the bones of, and you're going to be in charge. Where is the voice of a Palestinian? Palestinians have absolutely no say and have been completely disenfranchised by this process, not even consulted, and not even those who might even accept the capitulation in the form of the PA, not even them. So what kind of future do we see for the Palestinians, and do we not respect them enough to recognize them as human beings? But I think for us, as an ummah, this is an Islamic channel for us.
Yes.
We have to be reflective, and we have to understand that our abandoning of the right of resistance that Allah gives us and Allah names as jihad, our abandoning of that right of resistance to occupation and to oppression is what has led us to being so humiliated as an ummah. And when we talk and our ulama tell us about one part of the ummah being hurt, that the rest of the body feels it, I don't think we're feeling it. We're still living our lavish lives here. We're still purchasing all of the products that Israel is that fuel Israel and are complicit with. And we don't even seem to have a conscience about it, because we go about our daily lives without realizing that a young child like Hind al-Rajab, brutally shot down. And I can never forget her voice coming across to the paramedics when she was trying to call them. And they asked her, why are you quiet, Hind? Why aren't you speaking? Trying to check if she was still alive. And she said, I'm so scared. I'm going to mess this beautiful dress my mother had given me with the blood that's coming out of my mouth. How, Fahraaz? And I'm sorry to get emotional.
No, you have every right to.
She's one
Zeenat,
child, but we've been watching this for
There's
2
thousands and thousands
whole
of children,
years, watching these children decapitated, watching these children have their limbs torn off, watching these children have such resilience and sumud, watching these children pray every day, and we don't believe that we're going to be held accountable, and that they will. We say these are shaheed, these are the martyrs. What is shaheed? They are witness, and not just witness to what's happening in the oppression that they are under, but witness to our incapacity and our inaction. And we are going to be held accountable for that in the akhirah.
Zeenat, we have to end it here. Shukran so much for making the time for us. I really, really appreciate your analyst, your wisdom, and just making the time to spend to us. We really appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That is Zeenat Adam, just having this discussion with regards to 2 years of the Gaza genocide, and she ended off beautifully. Self-reflection. That's what we need to do, not just as human beings, but also as the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's all we have for you. I'll have more for you on a genocide that never stopped. Do stay tuned to Hilaal TV for more coverage as we mark 2 years of the Gaza genocide. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh from myself and the rest of the team in Johannesburg.